They said a woman traveling alone was brave, but a woman traveling alone with twins, no money, no ring, and no name waiting for her. That was something else entirely. That was a ghost walking in daylight. When Martha Silas stepped off the train in Dry Willow, Montana, the dust didn't even seem to notice her. She had one child clutched in each arm, their small faces buried in the thin wool of her coat. Besides them, all she carried was a tin of cold beans and a letter from a man named Calvin Price, a letter that promised a home. The paper was crumpled so many times it felt like old skin. He was a rancher, his ad said, needing a wife, willing, healthy, and firm with children. Martha was all those things. She just hadn't expected him to be waiting on the platform, take one look at her and sneer. "You didn't mention the baggage." He wasn't talking about a trunk. He was looking at her 7-year-old twins, Tommy and Daisy, as if they were vermin she'd brought into his clean town. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder, with a face that looked like it had been carved from sour wood. His rejection wasn't quiet. It was a performance for the whole station to see. He tore her letter in two and dropped the pieces in the dust. Then he walked away without another word, leaving her standing there as the train hissed and groaned, preparing to abandon her just like he had. The silence that fell was louder than the engine. It was the sound of every door in the world slamming shut at once. She sank onto a wooden crate, pulling her children close. The station clerk looked over, his eyes full of a pity that felt like salt on a wound. "You sure he was coming for you, ma'am?" he asked. Martha managed a smile that felt like breaking glass. "I think he's not." She opened her satchel, pulled out 2 dry biscuits, and broke them into 3 pieces. She gave the bigger halves to the little ones. Always. Them first. She didn't take a bite herself. Hope, she was discovering, tasted a lot like ash, and it filled you up just the same. But what Martha didn't know, what Calvin Price didn't know, was that this public shaming was the first link in a chain of events that would unravel a dark secret festering in the heart of Dry Willow. And it all started because someone else was watching. Down the street, hidden in the shadows of his porch, a man named Elias Granger lowered the broom in his hand. He was a widower, a man who'd made a sacred vow to himself the day he buried his wife. Never again. Never get involved. Never let another soul inside the walls he'd built around his heart. He watched the woman on the crate. He watched the children who didn't cry. And he watched the morning move on without the man who'd made a promise. Something stirred in the hollow place in his chest. A ghost of a feeling he thought he'd buried for good. He told himself to turn away, to go inside, to let the world handle its own cruelties. But he didn't. He just kept watching. Because something about her stillness, her quiet dignity in the face of absolute ruin, reminded him of another woman, another promise, another betrayal. And the wind that morning carried more than just dust. It carried the scent of a storm that had been brewing for years. Elias Granger hadn't meant to get involved. He'd spent the last 8 years perfecting the art of not getting involved. Life out here was hard enough without taking on the burdens of a stranger. Kindness didn't soften the land, he told himself. It only made you bleed longer when the land decided to cut you. He went inside his small, quiet house, the house where his wife Sarah's laughter still echoed if he let it. He stood at his kitchen window, a dry biscuit in his own hand, and watched. He watched as the sun climbed higher, baking the dust on the street. He watched as the woman and her 2 silent children sat on that crate for what must have been an hour, then 2. A living statue of abandoned hope. He still didn't move when she finally stood up. He didn't move when she pulled the children's threadbare coats tighter around their shoulders, a useless gesture against a cold that was more than weather. He didn't even move when they started walking, not toward anything, just away. Away from the platform, away from the silence, away from the 2 torn pieces of paper that were her future. He didn't move until the boy, Tommy, tripped in a rut. The child went down hard, scraping his knee on the unforgiving dirt. He didn't wail. He didn't even cry out. He just looked up at his mother, his jaw set with a kind of tight, weary bravery that no 7-year-old should ever have to learn. It was the look of a boy who knew there was no room for his own pain. That's when Elias put down the biscuit. Martha had no plan. She only had the word forward. It had always been enough. Until now. Her few coins felt heavy and useless in her pocket. She knew how to work, how to mend, how to make a meal from almost nothing. But you couldn't work for people who looked through you. You couldn't earn a place in a town that had already decided you didn't belong. The eyes of strangers followed her down the street, weighing her, judging her, dismissing her. She felt their stares like little stones against her back. Then a quiet voice came from behind her. "Ma'am." She turned slowly, bracing herself like an old tree that expects the axe. It was the man from the porch. His skin was darkened by the sun, his cheeks weathered by the wind, and his eyes held a sorrow so deep it looked like a secret he was sworn to keep. "I've got a fire going," Elias said, his voice rough but not unkind. "And 3 bowls. If you don't mind beans." Martha hesitated. Trust was a currency she no longer had. He seemed to understand. "Didn't ask what church you belong to," he added gently. "Or who them children's father is. Just figured folks ought not to walk hungry in a town that's still got stew on the stove." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, fierce and fast. She would not cry in front of a stranger. She would not. "Just for a bit," she finally said, her voice a near whisper. "Just for a bit," he echoed, and led the way to his small house. The twins ate like they hadn't seen food in a week. They hunched over their bowls, spoons clattering, their small faces serious with the task of filling the emptiness inside them. Elias didn't ask questions. He didn't ask what train brought them or what man had failed them. He just cleared the bowls when they were done, brewed some chicory coffee that was more bitter than sweet, and stoked the fire. The silence between them wasn't the awkward silence of strangers. It was something else. A shared quiet, like the hush that falls after a storm has passed, leaving wreckage in its wake. Martha helped dry the dishes, her hands moving with a slow, sure grace that spoke of a lifetime of work. When she finally stood to leave, gathering her children, Elias surprised himself. The words came out before he could stop them. "You got a place?" She hesitated, the lie already forming on her lips. "We'll find something." He looked past her, out the window toward the dark shape of his barn. "There's hay out back, not much, but I've kept it dry. Roof doesn't leak." Martha looked at him then, truly looked, and she saw not a man offering charity, but a man who understood. He understood that dignity was a shelter all its own, and sometimes it was the only one a person had left. That night, for the first time in a long time, Martha and her children slept under a roof that didn't threaten to collapse. She lay curled around them in the clean, sweet-smelling hay, listening to the sound of their breathing. In the house, Elias sat by his fire, listening to the wind thrum against the windows. He didn't even know their names. But the house felt less empty. It was as if this strange, broken family hadn't just brought their worn-out shoes and shawls through his door. They'd brought life back in. But life, once you let it in, is a demanding guest. It asks for more than just shelter. It starts to ask for hope. And hope was a far more dangerous thing to offer than a bed of hay. It was a risk Elias had sworn he would never take again. Because the last time he'd hoped, it had cost him everything. In the weeks that followed, Martha moved like a ghost through Elias Granger's life. She kept her head down and her hands busy, always busy. She swept his hearth before he woke, her broom making soft, rhythmic whispers against the stone. She mended his shirts with stitches so fine you could barely see them. She made his biscuits lighter and flakier than his own mother ever had. But she never overstepped. She and the children stayed in the barn, even as the nights grew colder. She never sat at his table unless expressly invited, and she always kept her boots laced tight, as if she were ready to run at a moment's notice. Elias didn't ask questions, but he saw everything. He saw how she never took the last piece of cornbread. He saw how she waited until he was outside before she allowed herself to hum a quiet, sad tune. He saw the way she looked at the rocking chair by the fire, Sarah's chair, with a longing that was almost painful to watch. He could have told her to unlace her boots. He could have told her she wasn't a burden. But he knew that some wounds, especially the ones on the inside, had to heal on their own time. You couldn't rush them, any more than you could rush the turning of the seasons. But the town of Dry Willow was not nearly as patient. Their whispers started as a low hum and grew into a steady buzz. "She's still out in your barn?" the shopkeeper asked, his eyes narrow as he weighed out a bag of flour for Elias. "She's got the children," Elias said, his voice flat, offering no more explanation. "She's got no husband," the man replied, the words slow and pointed. Elias didn't answer. He just paid for the flour and walked out, his jaw tight. The whispers followed him. They clung to him like burrs. At church, the pews on either side of him seemed to have more space than they used to. Old friends of his late wife, women who had once brought him casseroles and comfort, now gave him tight, disapproving smiles. They were judging him. But worse, they were judging Martha. They looked at her as if she were a thief who had stolen something that wasn't hers to take, as if his kindness was a limited resource that she was using up. One evening, after the twins were asleep in the hay, Martha came to the door of the house. She was holding a quilt she had mended, the patch-up work nearly invisible. Sarah's quilt. "I figured this belonged in here," she said quietly, placing it on the old rocking chair by the fire. "You're welcome to the seat, too," Elias said, his voice softer than he intended. She hesitated, then sat on the very edge of the chair, her back ramrod straight. The firelight flickered across her face, showing the fine lines of worry and exhaustion around her eyes. "Folks are talking," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the flames. "I know how this must look." Elias didn't flinch. "I lost my wife 8 years ago," he said, his voice low and steady. "Folks had words about how long I wore black, too, and then they had words about when I stopped. People will always find something to whisper about, Martha. It's how they fill their own silences." She looked down at her own hands, worn and chapped from work. "I came here hoping for a husband, a man who'd take us in, Mr. Price." He took one look at the children and walked away. "You deserve better than a man who sees children as baggage," Elias said simply. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with unspoken things, with shared grief and a fragile, budding trust. "I'm not asking for charity," she added, her voice fierce. "I'll work for our keep. I want my children to have warmth. A real roof." He nodded slowly. "You've already given this house more warmth than it's seen in years." The next morning, when Martha came to the kitchen to start the fire, she found a tin of coffee, real coffee, not chicory, sitting on the counter. She hadn't bought it. There was also a small stack of lumber piled neatly by the barn door. No words were spoken. But a message had been sent, a silent promise. Still, the town's whispers grew louder, sharper, and Martha kept her boots laced. Because she had learned the hard way that kindness wasn't always a shield. Sometimes it was just the quiet before the storm. And what she didn't realize was that the lumber wasn't just for patching the barn. It was the beginning of a foundation. But a foundation for what? A home? Or a battleground? The whispers were about to turn into shouts. Spring came late to Dry Willow that year. It was stubborn and shy, just like Martha herself. But when it finally arrived, it came in a rush of defiant life. The creek behind the barn thawed and began to chatter. The old plum tree by the kitchen window exploded into a cloud of white blossoms overnight, and for the first time since they arrived, Tommy and Daisy ran barefoot in the cool, damp grass, their laughter a sound that had been absent for far too long. And still Martha kept her boots laced. She cooked Elias's meals as if she were a temporary guest. She mended his clothes with the quiet efficiency of a hired hand. Every evening she would stand on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, while Elias smoked his pipe on the top step. She waited. She was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to curdle, for the quiet request for her to move on. But that night the request that came was not the one she was expecting. "Would you sit a while, Martha?" Elias asked, tapping the empty space on the bench beside him. She did. And the silence that settled between them was different. It wasn't the silence of strangers or the silence of an employer and his help. It was the comfortable, worn-in quiet that exists between two people who have seen the worst of life and are still, somehow, sitting on a porch watching the fireflies rise. He cleared his throat, a rough, gravelly sound. "I've been thinking." Martha's hands clenched in her lap. "Here it comes," she thought. "I'm going to build a proper room onto the house," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the barn where she and the children slept. "For you and the twins. You shouldn't be out there any longer." A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. But it was followed by the cold tide of reality. "I'm grateful, Elias, truly, but this isn't my home." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face in the twilight. "Why not?" The question startled her. Because I wasn't chosen. I'm just here." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice low and intense. "Martha, you were chosen the day you arrived. You were chosen when you gave Tommy and Daisy the bigger halves of your last biscuit. You were chosen when you mended a quilt that held memories that weren't yours, just because it needed mending. You were chosen when my house started to feel like a home again, not because of the food you cooked, but because you brought laughter back inside its walls." Silence. The air crackled with it. "You deserve more than shelter," he continued, his voice softer now. "More than being someone's charity case." He stood up then, a tall, solid silhouette against the darkening sky. He took off his worn hat and held it by the brim, twisting it in his hands. "So this ain't charity, Martha." She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Elias's voice shook just a little. "It's a proposal, not for a cook, not for a nanny, for you." Tears filled her eyes, blurring the edges of the world. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her hand reached for his, a slow, trembling gesture. He met her halfway, his calloused fingers closing around hers, warm and strong. "You're the first man who's ever really seen me," she whispered. He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his face. "No, ma'am. I'm just the first one who wasn't afraid to look." That night, for the first time, her boots stayed by the door, unlaced. The next morning Martha walked into the kitchen barefoot, humming a tune that wasn't sad at all. But their new-found peace was a fragile thing, like a plum blossom in a late frost. The town hadn't finished whispering, and her past hadn't finished with her. A proposal couldn't erase a history. In fact, it was about to bring it roaring into the present, because someone in Dry Willow knew exactly who she had run from, and they were about to send an invitation. It started with a pie. Mrs. Langley, a woman whose smile was as sharp as a needle, brought it to the door one Sunday after church. "Apple cinnamon," she announced, her eyes sliding right past Martha to land on Elias. "Thought it'd be a nice welcome. For the arrangement." The word arrangement hung in the air, sweet and poisonous. Then came the questions wrapped in polite concern. "I suppose she won't be staying in the barn anymore," she chirped. "No," Elias said, his voice a low warning. Mrs. Langley's eyebrows shot up. Oh, so she's more than just hired help, then. Martha, standing just inside the doorframe, felt the familiar chill of judgment. This was how it started. Not with shouts, but with pies and pointed questions. The town was drawing a line in the dust, and she was on the wrong side of it. At the general store, conversations would stop when she walked in. At church, mothers would pull their children a little closer. The women who were friends of Elias's late wife, Sarah, now looked at Martha with a cold fury, as if she were trying to erase a ghost, as if her presence was a betrayal. She held her head high, but inside, the old walls were starting to crumble. It wasn't the whispers that hurt the most. It was the silence, the way they looked through her as if she were already gone. It was Tommy who finally gave it a voice. "Mama," he asked one afternoon, his small face scrunched in confusion, "how come those ladies don't like you?" She knelt and tied his shoelace, her fingers moving slowly. "Sometimes," she said, her voice soft, "people get scared when they see something broken start to heal. It reminds them of their own cracks." That evening, Elias found her sitting alone under the plum tree. "They'll come around," he said, his voice full of a confidence she couldn't feel. "Maybe," she answered, not looking at him. "But what if they don't? What if I've just brought my trouble to your doorstep, Elias?" "This is your doorstep now, too," he said firmly. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "And we'll face whatever comes, together." But a new threat was already on its way. It wasn't a whisper or a sideways glance. It was an envelope tucked into their mail with no return address. Just Martha's name, scrawled in an angry, jagged hand. She opened it with trembling fingers. The note inside was short and brutal. "I know who you are. I know what you did to your husband. A God-fearing town like this deserves to know the truth about the viper they've let in. You have 1 week to leave, or everyone will know." The blood drained from her face. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Someone in this town knew her past. But then she looked closer at the handwriting, at the specific way the T was crossed. And a horrifying realization dawned on her. She recognized the script. It wasn't from a stranger. It was the handwriting of Mrs. Langley. But how could she possibly know? Unless she wasn't just a town gossip. Unless she was connected to the man Martha had run from. The past wasn't just catching up to her. It had been waiting for her here all along. Martha didn't show Elias the letter. Not at first. Shame was a heavy coat, and she was used to wearing it alone. The letter sat tucked in her apron pocket, a piece of poison paper resting against her skin. Every tick of the clock in Elias's kitchen sounded like a countdown. 1 week. She found Elias in the barn mending a harness, his hands strong and sure. The smell of leather and hay was comforting, but it couldn't touch the cold knot of fear in her stomach. "I was married before," she began, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. He didn't stop his work. He just grunted. "Figured as much." "I left him," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. "I ran. I took the children, and I ran in the middle of the night." He finally looked up, his eyes holding hers. "Did you have a good reason to run, Martha?" Tears she had held back for years began to fall. "He had a temper. The bruises. They started on my arms where the sleeves would hide them. Then my ribs. The day he knocked Tommy down for spilling a glass of milk. That was the day I knew. I had to go. I walked through a snowstorm for 2 miles to the nearest town, with Daisy on my back and Tommy holding my hand. I never looked back. Elias put down the harness and came to her. He didn't touch her. He just stood in front of her, a solid, unshakable presence. That's not running, Martha. That's surviving. That's protecting your children. There's no shame in that. That's as holy a thing as a person can do. His words were a balm on a wound she didn't know was still open. But the relief was short-lived. The letter was still in her pocket. "There are folks here who won't see it that way," she whispered. "Someone knows. They sent a letter. They want me gone." "Then they weren't people worth having around in the first place," he said, his jaw tightening. He finally reached out and gently took her hand. "You are not your past, Martha. You are the woman who makes this broken-down ranch feel like a palace, and anyone who tries to run you off will have to go through me." His fierce loyalty was a shield, but as she looked at him, a new, more terrible thought took root. Mrs. Langley. How did she know? There was only one way. She must have been in contact with him, with Bartholomew Kane, her monster of a husband. He wasn't just a memory. He knew where she was. The thought sent a tremor of pure terror through her. This wasn't just about town gossip anymore. This was about a man who would not stop until he got what he wanted, and he believed Tommy and Daisy were his property. The next day, a wagon rolled into town. A fancy wagon, pulled by two fine black horses. The man who stepped out of it wore a tailored coat and polished boots that seemed to mock the dusty street. It was him, Bartholomew Kane. He didn't look like a monster. He looked charming. He smiled at the people on the street. He tipped his hat, and then his eyes found Martha, standing frozen on the porch of Elias's house. His smile widened. It was the smile of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. He wasn't just here to take the children. He was here to destroy her, and he was going to make the entire town of Dry Willow help him do it. Bartholomew Kane didn't storm the porch. He was smarter than that. He walked directly to the sheriff's office. An hour later, Sheriff Brody, a man who generally preferred his job to be quiet and simple, walked up to Elias's ranch. Kane was right behind him, a look of solemn concern on his face. "Elias," the sheriff said, looking uncomfortable, "this man, Mr. Kane, says this woman, Martha, is his legal wife, says she absconded with his children." "She ran to save their lives," Elias said, his voice a low growl. He stood on the porch, a human wall between Kane and the house where Martha and the twins were hiding. Kane stepped forward, his voice smooth as oil. "Sheriff, my wife is unwell. She has spells. She imagines things. I've been worried sick about her and my children. All I want is to bring my family home." He looked at Elias with mock pity. "I'm afraid she's taken advantage of your kindness, sir." The sheriff looked from Kane's expensive suit to Elias's worn work clothes. He looked at the small, tidy ranch. The town had been whispering for weeks about the strange woman in Elias's barn. Kane's story, as ugly as it was, fit the narrative they'd already written. "He's lying," Martha said, her voice shaking as she appeared in the doorway. "He's a monster." Kane's face crumpled in a mask of perfect sadness. "You see, Sheriff, the delusions. It's a terrible sickness." It was a masterstroke. He wasn't accusing her of being a bad woman. He was accusing her of being a mad one. It was a prison with no bars. How could she prove her sanity against the word of her own husband? "I have no choice, Elias," the sheriff said, his hand resting on his pistol. "The law is the law. He has papers. He's her husband. The children go with him." Panic seized Martha. This couldn't be happening. She had run so far, fought so hard, only to be trapped by a piece of paper. But then, something shifted. As Kane stepped forward to ascend the porch steps, a flash of recognition crossed Elias's face. It was subtle, just a flicker in his eyes. He wasn't just looking at Kane. He was looking at the ornate silver ring on Kane's pinky finger, a ring with the distinctive carving of a raven. Elias went very still. "Where did you get that ring?" he asked, his voice suddenly dangerously quiet. Kane scoffed. "It's a family heirloom." "Why?" My wife, Elias said, his eyes locking onto Kane's, was wearing a ring just like it the day she died. She was run down by a wagon on the road near Calvin Price's north pasture. They called it a hunting accident. They never found the driver. The air went thick and heavy. Kane's confident smile faltered for the first time. The sheriff frowned, confused. "What are you implying, Granger?" Kane sneered. "I'm not implying anything," Elias said, taking a deliberate step forward. "I'm telling you. My wife, Sarah, she was a bookkeeper. She did work for some of the ranchers around here, including Calvin Price. She told me she'd found something, discrepancies in his books. She said he was involved in something crooked with a partner from back east, a man she was afraid of." Every word was a hammer blow. Martha stared at Elias, a wild, impossible idea blooming in her mind. Calvin Price, the man who had humiliated her, the man who had written her the letter to come to Dry Willow in the first place. It wasn't a coincidence. None of it was. Price hadn't rejected her just because of the twins. He had been waiting for her. He had been working with her husband all along. This was a trap. They had lured her here to this remote town to take the children and silence her for good. And in their arrogance, they had chosen the one town, the one ranch, owned by the one man whose life they had already destroyed. The web wasn't just closing in on Martha. It was closing in on all of them. And Elias Granger finally understood that the ghost he'd been living with for 8 years had a name. And that name was Bartholomew Kane. The pieces slammed together in Martha's mind with the force of a physical blow. The ad, Calvin Price's public rejection, Mrs. Langley's letter. It was all a performance, a carefully staged play designed to isolate her, to paint her as unstable and untrustworthy long before her husband even arrived. They wanted the town to turn on her, so when Kane showed up playing the part of the grieving husband, no one would believe her. And it had almost worked. "That's a ridiculous story," Kane spat, but a bead of sweat was tracing a path down his temple. "You're just trying to protect this woman." "Am I?" Elias's voice was cold iron. "Sheriff, my wife kept meticulous records, copies of everything. She told me if anything ever happened to her, to look in the old family Bible. I looked for years. I never found anything. I thought she was just being paranoid." He turned his gaze on Martha, and there was no accusation in it, only a dawning, terrible understanding. "But her Bible went missing from the house right after she died." Martha's blood ran cold. The barn. The night she had found that old locket. There was something else in that dusty chest. A heavy leather-bound book. She had assumed it was Elias's and hadn't wanted to pry, so she had left it there, hidden under old blankets. A Bible. "It's in the barn," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "In a sea chest. I thought it was yours." Kane's composure finally shattered. His eyes darted toward the barn, a flash of pure animal panic in them. "She's lying. Seize her, Sheriff." But Sheriff Brody was no longer looking at Martha. He was looking at Kane's expensive suit, at Calvin Price's sprawling ranch just over the hill, and at Elias Granger, a man he had known his entire life as honest and quiet. A man whose wife had died in a mysterious accident that had never sat right with him. "Hold on now, Kane," the sheriff said slowly, his hand moving away from his gun. "I think we'll just take a look at that Bible." It was the opening they needed. Before Kane could react, Elias moved. He wasn't a young man, but years of hard ranch work had kept him strong. He shoved the sheriff toward the barn. "Go, get the book. I'll hold him off." Kane lunged, not at Elias, but at Martha. "The children!" he roared, his mask of civility gone, revealing the monster beneath. "They're mine!" Tommy and Daisy, who had been watching from the doorway, screamed. Martha threw herself in front of them. This was it, the final confrontation. Not in a snowy forest in the dead of night, But here, in the bright Montana sun, with the whole world watching. But something was different this time. She wasn't alone. Elias grabbed Cain by the collar of his expensive coat and threw him off the porch. The two men crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Elias was fighting for the memory of his dead wife. Cain was fighting for his freedom. The sheriff, spurred to action, raced toward the barn. But he wasn't alone. From the neighboring ranch, two men who had seen the commotion came running, rifles in hand. The whispers of the town had finally given way to the hard reality of violence, and people were choosing a side. They were choosing Elias. Inside the house, Martha grabbed her children. "Stay here. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me or Elias." Tommy, his face pale but his eyes resolute, nodded. He was no longer the little boy who tripped in the road. He was the man of the house now. He bolted the door. Martha turned, her eyes scanning the porch. Her gaze fell on a heavy cast-iron skillet she had left by the door. Without a second thought, she grabbed it. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and she was done running. She burst back out onto the porch just as Cain landed a vicious punch to Elias's jaw, sending him stumbling back. Cain scrambled to his feet, a wild look in his eyes. He saw the sheriff emerging from the barn, holding up a thick, leather-bound book. It was over, and he knew it. With a final desperate roar, Cain charged not at Elias, but at the sheriff, trying to get the book. But he never made it. Martha stepped forward, raised the heavy skillet, and brought it down on the back of Bartholomew Cain's head with all the force of her fear, her rage, and her love for her children. He dropped like a sack of rocks. Silence descended on the yard, broken only by the sound of labored breathing. Elias stared at Martha, a look of stunned awe on his face. The neighboring ranchers stared. Sheriff Brody stood frozen, the Bible clutched in his hand. Martha stood over the unmoving form of her husband, the iron skillet still gripped in her hand, her chest heaving. The ghost who had walked into Dry Willow had finally learned how to fight, and the whole town had seen it. The whispers were over. The truth, when it came out, was uglier than anyone in Dry Willow could have imagined. Sarah Granger's Bible didn't just contain scripture. Tucked between the pages of Leviticus were meticulously kept notes and copies of ledger pages. It detailed a massive land fraud scheme run by Bartholomew Cain and Calvin Price. They were using Cain's legal expertise to swindle ranchers out of their land and water rights, bleeding them dry before buying their properties for pennies on the dollar. Sarah had discovered the truth while doing Price's books. She had confronted him, and for her honesty, Cain and Price had run her down with a wagon, staging it to look like an accident. The silver raven ring was from a secret society they belonged to, a symbol of their partnership. Luring Martha to Dry Willow was their final, arrogant mistake. Cain needed to silence her, and Price wanted the satisfaction of breaking the woman who had defied his partner. They never imagined their two separate crimes would lead to the same small ranch, to the one man who had the power to connect them. With Cain unconscious and the Bible in the sheriff's hands, Calvin Price was arrested within the hour. Mrs. Langley, implicated as a co-conspirator who had passed information to Cain, tried to flee but was caught before she reached the county line. The town of Dry Willow was shaken to its core. The people who had whispered and judged Martha were now forced to look at their own blindness. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Elias and Martha sat on the porch bench. The children were asleep inside, safe in a real bed for the first time. The silence between them was not one of grief or uncertainty, but of profound, bone-deep peace. "He's really gone?" Martha asked, the question a fragile wisp of hope. "He'll never hurt you or those children again," Elias promised. "Neither will Price. Justice for them, and justice for Sarah." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a weary gratitude. She would have liked you, Martha. You have the same steel in your spine. Martha leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture that felt both new and anciently familiar. She was home. It wasn't the home she had been promised in a letter, but a home she had fought for, bled for, and earned. A few weeks later, after the dust had truly settled, Elias brought her to the edge of the pasture. There was a new sign hammered into the earth, its letters freshly carved and painted. It didn't say Granger Ranch. It said Hearthstead Ranch. "For the hearth you rebuilt," he said quietly, "and for the steady heart that did it." He took off his hat, holding it over his own heart. "Martha Silas, you are the bravest woman I have ever known. I know this isn't how things are supposed to be done, but I'm asking you again. Properly, this time. Will you marry me? Will you and the children make this our home, for good?" She didn't need to whisper her answer this time. Her yes was as clear and bright as the Montana sky. The road we think will save us often leads to ruin, but sometimes it's the dead end, the place where we are abandoned and left with nothing, that turns out to be the start of the real journey home. Martha didn't find the life she was promised, but she found something far better. A life she had chosen, built on a foundation of truth, respect, and a quiet, resilient love. The twins, Tommy and Daisy, grew up strong and kind on that ranch, knowing they were doubly chosen. Once by a mother who risked everything for them, and again by a man who saw their family not as baggage, but as a blessing. They learned that the truest families aren't always the ones you're born into, but the ones you build in the aftermath of a storm. If this story reminded you that even the most broken things can be mended, and that strength often comes in the quietest forms, don't forget to subscribe. We believe every soul has a story worth telling, and every story has a lesson worth sharing. Share this with someone who has weathered their own storm and come out stronger on the other side. And let us know in the comments below. What do you think is the truest definition of family? Your stories give us all hope. We're listening.